Hi, my name is Haseeb Ahmed, and currently I'm a fine arts researcher at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, the Netherlands. This paper examines the relationship of form and identity in American Muslim communities in the Midwest region through Islamic center architecture. Today, I would like to focus on the typology of Islamic center as a unique form developed by American Muslim diaspora communities and since promulgated to Western Europe, South America, Australia, and other places. The form of the Islamic center arises from the array of social formations it contains. However, insofar as the Islamic center form is derived from traditional architectural form, it allows for the constituent community to inhabit their identities born out of the experience of diaspora. My central question here is, how is the particular form of the contemporary Islamic center constructed to reflect the collective identity of a community that is in fact deeply diverse and even divided? Islamic centers arose in the mid-1970s after a wave of South Asian immigration to the United States. These communities met with Arab-American communities existent since the early 1900s, as well as African American, Hispanic, Southeast Asian, and Turkish communities, among others, already existent in the United States. The Islamic Center of Greater Toledo, my focus here today, was constructed collaboratively in the late 1970s by Lebanese and Syrian and South Asian American communities, and yet they continue to function as community centers for the newly arrived diaspora at the point of arrival in the United States. So the latest community that was incorporated would be the Bosnian community in the 1990s, for instance. Just to give you a quick sense of the region that I'm talking about, the Midwestern U.S., this is the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo, and if we zoom out, we continue to zoom out. This is the Great Lakes. This is Ohio here. This is the Great Lakes region, and it sits at the center of the U.S. So, just to continue, these structures are often massive to house all functions of religious and social life. Their construction involves years of dedicated community fundraising. This community must then continue to support the center in order to maintain the costly structures and to pay off the debt incurred through financing the project. Eventually, the community of founders is dutifully bound to the construction they initiate, but these original communities merge, often hierarchically, into the growing constituent communities of the Islamic Center. Each aggregate American Muslim community is recognized by its successful establishment of an Islamic Center. The history of each community is seamlessly couched within a larger narrative of Islamic history, starting with the inception of Islam itself. This narrative is a modern one, and its current form arose out of the nationalist movements during the period of decolonization in the mid-1900s. The concept of the Ummah, or the collective body of believers, is readily used to describe the implicit bond of Muslims worldwide. In its modern form, this imagination maps onto that of the nation-state. So while the communities within the particular Islamic center are diverse, they can identify as citizens of a common state that as of yet has not arisen in the most ideal terms. Whether most American Muslims believe in the eventuality of this state is highly unlikely. Even politically, this idea fell apart together with the movements like Arab nationalism in the 1970s and the failure of countries originating in the name of Islam like Iran and Pakistan. However, these mechanisms gained currency because it corresponds to the collective condition of being of diaspora communities within the United States, a condition that each person in an Islamic center shares with one another. The Islamic Center takes on its form corresponding to its role as infrastructure, providing all basic civil facilities. However, this infrastructure is housed within a particular form of the octagon, which I will discuss. One caveat I'd like to address quickly is, just in terms of Islamic studies, I was talking about the range of of immigrant communities in the United States, South Asian, Lebanese, Syrian, but I also wanted to talk about, just briefly mention that what you would call indigenous Muslim communities, which is the African American community, which is slightly different because of the influence of black nationalist movements in the 1960s and 70s. African American Muslims often belong to the Nation of Islam that has a unique history within the United States, and this is brought about by its institutional repression in the United States until the early 1960s. So that was just a quick note. The picture that you're seeing here is the founding group of the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo. But okay, so just to continue, I'd like to pursue this question about the relationship of form and identity in American Muslim diaspora communities by looking at the architectural form of the Islamic Center itself and the types of social relations it engenders. Firstly, the Islamic Center is distinct from the mosque that is ubiquitous to countries within countries with Muslim populations. The mosque functions as a prayer space 5 times daily. Each prayer takes roughly 5 to 10 minutes, excluding Friday prayers that include a khutbah or sermon. The congregation at a mosque is a temporary community and not consistent, being used by any one Muslim who happens to be nearby. The Islamic Center, on the other hand, features large prayer halls to subsume mosque functionality. They rarely host 5 daily prayers, as they do not replace the mosque in Midwestern cities. Instead, the Islamic Center houses weekend and full-time schools, cultural festivals, interfaith dialogues, lectures, libraries, staffed medical clinics, mortuaries, and kitchens. It can hold funeral ceremonies, weddings, school assemblies, lectures, and cooking exhibitions. Just a quick note, this is the prayer hall of the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo, and it's unique because it doesn't have a solid separation between men and women, which is common in all mosques. Instead, it has a kind of temporary barrier that sits in between. So this would be the women's side on the one side, what you see on the left here, or on the right, sorry, and on the other would be the men's side. And this is a point of great controversy for a while because it was seen as extremely liberal for some time, but has since been adopted all over the U.S. The Islamic Center is meant to provide all basic infrastructures and mirrors the outside world in this regard in miniature. The Islamic Center construction is justified as a utopian future of an immigrant community that does not yet know its own future in a new homeland. In the master plan, schools and elderly homes are centered around the prayer hall. This existence of the building allows the communities to literally separate and relate to one another through an organizational basis along the lines of the division of labor entailed in maintaining the center. Within the communities, non-ethnic formations like women's auxiliary clubs, council of elders, and youth clubs arise. So for example, here you're seeing the model that was presented to the community when this, before the mosque was constructed, and this is the idea of what the mosque would become. Right now, this is the existent building, and it will likely never grow beyond this, but the vision that was presented was a huge school complex here, a home for elderly people once they grew old and retired, which is a major concern for the founding members, like what would happen to them when they grew old outside of the original communities, and then kind of like a multi-purpose hall here. So this is a huge complex because this itself this building on its own is quite large. I'd like to take a few moments just to describe a few instances of the kind of social organization that arise inside of an established Islamic center. So first, here we have one of the kitchens, and every Sunday and every Friday, food is prepared in this main kitchen and served in the social hall. And the way that the decision on who's going to cook on that day is decided inside of the community. And usually, this is separated by ethnic groups. So, for example, the Pakistani community will agree, and then inside of the Pakistani community, each family will take turns preparing food for the entire Muslim community, which is composed of many different ethnic groups. So this is a Lebanese group right now preparing fatayrs, falafels, and other things like this. One moment. This is the Council of Elders, who are some of the first people who would form the mosque after they'd grown old. And if you see, for example, one of their jobs is that it's a Council of Elders' job to decide all of the decoration that goes inside of the mosque. So there's a huge number of donations of decorative objects that are donated to the mosque, and each one of these like wall hangings is decided by them. Then there's also a full-time school with about 100 students, and also a temporary Sunday school for religious education. This usually involves the normal state curriculum with extra classes of in Arabic, Quranic recitation, and religious studies as well. This is a school hallway here. So the Islamic Center, many of these formations are centered around volunteering and forms of care. The Islamic Center in this way provides a spiritual, social, and educational life. A confusion occurs here whether this activity is for the center itself, the people in the center, or even the personal obligation to the faith. I'd like to continue to give an image of the Islamic Center in order to answer this question. The Islamic Center is usually located in the suburbs of major cities and visited on Fridays, the Islamic Holy Day, on Sundays, which is the adopted holy day because of the calendar of Judeo-Christian faith, which the U.S. Working Week is structured around. Commonly, the center is not conceived as a mosque. Rather, it's treated as a destination. The suburb offers large parcels of land, and size does matter. As I mentioned before, economic affairs bind together a community. However, in the culture created by the auto industry in the Midwest, this has an effect. Cities are designed around cars and not made for pedestrian travel. As the architectural theorist Robert Venturi has noted in Learning from Las Vegas, everything is seen from the speed of a passing car, so the structures are meant to communicate and must be large enough to ensure time enough to be seen. The Islamic Center of Greater Toledo, my case study here today, sits at the interchange of Interstates 80-90 and the Interstate 75. All traffic from the East Coast to Chicago or Detroit from New York and other East Coast cities must pass directly in front of the Islamic Center. What's more, this region of Ohio is entirely flat and used to grow corn or soybeans. The structure can be seen from a great distance and communicates the presence of a community here. Toledo now has a population of nearly 7,000 Muslims. The city itself is nearly 1 million. This was the largest Islamic center in North America from its inauguration in 1983 until it was surpassed in 2002 by the Islamic Center of America in neighboring Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn has a population of 40,000 Arab Americans, many of whom are Muslim, and this is 40% of the total population of the city. That's the Islamic Center of America in Dearborn. And usually when people say in the US that it's the center of America or like the Mall of America, that means that it's extremely large. It's supposed to be really big. So both of these centers sit at the automotive industrial corridor of the Great Lakes, centered around Detroit, which was the reason for immigration in the 1920s and 30s, but both of these centers at their inception functioned as mosques. Toledo had its Bancroft Street Mosque in 1954, and Dearborn had its Syrian Society Mosque in 1936. The amount of income of Dearborn and Toledo residents alike is roughly $40,000 a year, kind of working class wages. However, the influx of South Asians in the 1970s, who were mostly in the medical profession in Toledo, Ohio, brought about the earlier founding of the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo. In the process of commissioning the architectural design of the Islamic Center, these communities engaged in a complex form of anachronism to legitimize the design choices on behalf of a multi-ethnic community intended to exist for generations. What is the historical basis of this architectural form? The way that its particular form occurs occurs thousands of miles and thousands of years outside of its supposed place of origin. Through my research and research of others on Islamic centers that are built to purpose in Midwestern U.S., almost all of them are composed of an octagonal plan. So from the plan above, the prayer hall is shaped like an octagon or eight-sided. Typologically, this plan can be traced back to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. It was built in 691 by the Caliph Abdul Malik, who was newly appointed governor of Syria and Lebanon. He was the first Umayyad Caliph, marking the first political division in the new Muslim empire between Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, after the first four caliphs chosen among the companions of the Prophet Muhammad had ended. Abdul Malik sought to increase the importance of his territory by producing new site of holy pilgrimage to increase his political importance. This site could be second only to the Kaaba in Mecca. The empty black cube, supposedly built by Abraham and Ismail under a holy influence towards which all devout Muslims still orient themselves in prayer 5 times daily. The Dome of the Rock sits atop what some say is the Temple of Solomon, destroyed by the Romans, which is supposedly the point of departure for the Prophet Muhammad in his kind of mythical trip to the heavens on the beast Burak, on Isra and Miraj, or the Night of Power. However, this is also, and it's likely that the site is in fact arbitrary, or is arbitrarily chosen. That's the Dome of the Rock there, or the rock that's inside. The architecture is largely borrowed from Byzantine architecture, and the plan is modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, also in Jerusalem. The only thing that makes it unique are the calligraphic inscriptions banded throughout the interior and the exterior of the building. The semi-nomadic Muslim Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula had not yet developed an architectural form of their own. The only complete original form of Islamic architecture is in fact muqarnas or stalactite vaults. Looking at a survey of Islamic architecture today, it is clear that each geographic area in what became a vast Muslim world developed a hybrid indigenous style of Islamic architecture. So each empire or dynasty formed their own architectural style, but relating to this original idea, which is in fact based on Byzantine architecture. So why does the octagonal plan of the mosque recur in Islamic centers throughout the Midwestern United States? Why do American Muslims of heterogeneous ethnic backgrounds repeatedly choose to identify themselves with this form and not others? It is my contention that this has to do with the last Muslim majority empire, that is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire also wanted to consolidate its power which was spread thin throughout a vast and ethnically diverse territory that included Jerusalem. For this reason, they also maintained the supposed last caliph or leader of the Muslim Ummah until its demise in the 1920s. The octagonal plan of the mosque cohered to other structures in the Ottoman capital, formerly Byzantium, and in order to produce an idiosyncrasy among those structures, and create a kind of similarity, they chose the octagonal plan as the archetype of mosque architecture throughout the empire. This empire, however, fell after World War I and was split up and divided as colonial territory amongst Western European allies. However, the octagonal form does not appear in Islamic centers in the United States today out of Ottoman will. We see it reoccur now because American Muslim community is engaged in a complex form of anachronism. It recurs out of the vicissitudes of the Ottoman desire to produce formal consistency. So this is the interior of the Dome of the Rock, and this is the plan of the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo, which are modeled on top of one another quite similarly. While the American Muslim community may not have a common basis in Ottoman Muslims on the basis of religion, they certainly do on the basis of the desire to create a formal and therefore visceral linkage over vast stretches of space and time. By tracing particularity of forms in the case of octagonal plan of Islamic Center in relationship to identities that they are meant to represent, the generality of social life is broken to reveal its underlying mechanisms and prime movers. This is the reason why I'm emphasizing the kind of architectural similarity is because it shows how identity is formulated inside of these communities. Generally, all religious communities today share the form that Emil Durkheim called in his 1912 Elementary Forms of Religious Life, mana. Mana is the way in which communities experience its collective alienated social force, which is mediated through a point of a single object or representation. The construction of an Ottoman mosque in the middle of the cornfields of Ohio gives its constituent communities a collective object of recognition that posits its origins thousands of miles away in an ambiguous temporal zone that is itself constructed out of an anachronism to provide social coherence originally within the Ottoman Empire. Due to the prolonged social effort involved in maintaining such massive structures, the community is kept from shifting out of this precarious condition and must inhabit and maintain the condition of the community life of first-generation immigrants who founded the Islamic Center. People may enter but can only leave as individuals. The community cannot change this fundamental form of the Islamic Center, and instead this leads to its reproduction when communities splinter, only to make new centers in the same form. So, meaning that the investment in these huge building projects kind of enforces a new kind of social form. It's difficult for communities to take on new types of forms, and oftentimes, in order to build upon a collective identity, they simply reproduce the same kind of architectural form which started. The building of the Islamic Center itself cannot blend back into vernacular architecture that surrounds it. It can only be appreciated as a permanent fixture in the landscape, positing permanent social difference no matter how integrated the community becomes over generations. So these are portraits of the community in 1954 and into the 60s in Toledo. And this is what the Islamic Center itself looks like now in the social hall there. And this is a photograph of at the groundbreaking. The groundbreaking of the mosque was actually supposed to happen, was made to happen by the children of the community, who are now still, using that mosque. To conclude, large Islamic centers constructed in the octagonal plan become a collective point of recognition that allow for the self-regulation of the community and services. This self-regulation gives a community composed of various ethnic groups with various immigration histories in the United States a coherent form. However, the form that this coherence has taken through the construction of large Islamic centers modeled on the octagonal plan also holds that community to a form, while its internal and generational ethnic life proceeds in different ways while living inside of the United States. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such an interesting paper. Any questions? Yeah, Seb.
Very short.
Just a moment, just microphone.
So very short, at least by my standards. The first question is that the way you described it, especially towards the end, and I will not criticize that, it seemed to be all very positive. It functions, gives the center to that community, fulfills a certain function of integration. It reminded me of something that one would have to criticize as an intellectual, but that I would like to see at some US airports when you're coming back while you're waiting for the baggage. There's a series of still photos about, these are Americans every day, and they're actually astonishingly many photos of clearly Muslim Americans, in front of the mosque and so forth. And it's also my experience, it kind of works, because of course, because of 9/11, and because of, somebody admire boundlessly Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and that story. There's an international reputation of Muslims always being systematically repressed in the US. Now, that's not what you're describing, but I'm interested. I hope not as an American citizen, but I want your... And then the second thing is a very American thing, and that would almost be a kind of litmus test of how much they're integrated. When you were saying this is the largest, the one used to be the largest mosque, but now the other one is larger. The one in Dearborn is larger than the one in Toledo. That reminded me of Texas. When you drive along the freeway in Texas, you always see these signs. My favorite one is, this is the world's largest church parking lot. Or this is the world's largest Stars and Stripes banner. So I'm wondering, this communities would be both Muslim and extremely mainstream American if they would really compete about. So if there was now a project in Toledo of building an even larger community center. So that's just... it's an ironic question, but it's also a very serious question. That would be, for me, the triumph of integration if they now competed about who has the largest community center.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that, because this is, I think, the more difficult point I was trying to make, and maybe it didn't come through clearly. I think the final argument I'm trying to make is that when these communities engage with these huge building projects that require hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the fundraising that requires, this is what allows the immigrant communities to consolidate. Even though they're all completely ethnically diverse, it gives them a single point of focus and allows them to form a community. But on the other hand, the form that they can agree on is something that is like distant to all of them, but which and distant also to the landscape of the United States. So what happens then is a kind of strange projection of identity outside, as if it's always outside. It's outside of the U.S., but it's also outside of any one of these ethnic groups as well. I think that this becomes a problem inside of these communities when they actually do become deeply integrated into social life in the United States. and they're still bound to these buildings themselves. So the buildings that they create, the things that they make, can't reflect the level of integration that they actually have. And so the places that I was looking at are maybe particular in the United States because in Ohio and Michigan and in this industrial corridor, these communities are old and they're deeply integrated into society because they are very much working class in a sense, and so there isn't this kind of there hasn't been the level of discrimination that has happened in other parts of the United States. There have been problems in the South and also in larger city centers like New York and in other places like this as well. It's a bit complex, I think, after this 9/11 thing. But I think that I don't mean to like reiterate the utopian image of the United States as some kind of like utopian melting pot or something like this. But instead, what I'm trying to talk about is like how this works originally, but then later on becomes a way of kind of also stagnating the community after its initial process of integration or immigration into the United States.
Lorenzo.
Okay, thank you. I have a small question about not about the building, but about the social activity of the center, Islamic center. And you have mentioned that there is an educational activity there, and Quran lessons, Arabic lessons, and also religious study. What does it mean, religious study? Do they learn Islam, and from Islamic perspective, they are other religious, or is this all such as cultural approach to other religions?
Well, I mean, it's a religious center, it's a mosque, so I think what the idea of there's two types of educational activity that happens. The first is that there's a full-time school, so one would send their children to this school instead of sending them to a public school, and this is like kind of actually a kind of attempt at trying to come to the level of Christian and Jewish communities inside of the U.S. which have their own schools, and then people say like, well, why don't we have our own schools? And so they essentially try to do this, and I mean, the curriculum is almost exactly the same because most of it is state mandated, except like they also teach Arabic courses, Quranic recitation courses, and then the curriculum of the Islamic studies is very much based on what I would call like a kind of modernist school, which is like also the same type of school where the concept of the ummah modeled on the nation state comes from. It's a kind of more egalitarian notion of Islam as some sort of encompassing religion, which is the last of the Abrahamic faiths, and not necessarily exclusionary. I mean, they still see themselves as a kind of minority community, so the education sort of starts from there in a sense. I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I think my question is actually in between the two previous questions, because at first I was inclined to understanding your presentation as we are now talking about diaspora, no longer in terms of an ethnic minority, but almost in terms of a minority politics, identity politics. That is to say, we're talking about Islamic people from many different countries, but we could be talking about any other minority and its rights and its politics, which is not necessarily ethnically oriented, because in this case it is religious. But then, of course, we're still talking about religion, and in terms of the formal aspect of your presentation, your emphasis on architecture, it seemed to me, especially with your genealogical architectural research, that what you call social adherence in the end is ultimately based on religion, nevertheless, which is, in a sense, I think it has to do with the question, what do they teach these kids? So, on the one hand, I agree with the first question insofar as especially the pictures, seem to be, well, they are very mainstream. The only specific thing about these pictures is that they apply to Islamic people. But in a sense, to go back to Tony Soprano, they could be applied to a whole series of different minority politics or minority identities, very postmodern in this sense, right? So we have the switch from the exploited Irish, Polish, Italians, etc., in New York, to quote Tony Soprano, the abused cowboys, the black lesbians, etc., etc., etc. Okay, but on the other hand, this switch towards postmodernism, hence an emphasis on minority politics instead on ethnic politics, is sort of actually not so postmodern, because the minimal communal denominator of what they do is Islam. You see my point? So, in a sense, it's really postmodern, but on the other hand, it's also very much ingrained. And this is the beginning of your presentation. You said that actually these people got together because they believed, in a sense, not in nation of Islam in the American sense, but in the utopia of a worldwide Islamic state. This is, I think, the tension in my understanding.
I think that you're locating it, like, you're very correct in locating it there, this tension between the modernist idea of the kind of global Islamic state as a very much an ideal. It's not like something to be realized, but this was a sort of, as I said, this is an ideology that grew out of decolonization because of the failure of decolonization all over the world, which forced all of these former colonies to turn back on their identities and reinvent their identities. And then they had to do so oftentimes in terms of religious. So especially a country like Pakistan, for example, which had to find a way of distinguishing itself from India, had to reinvent a completely new identity based on religion and this kind of thing. So this is where the kind of ummah, this idea comes from. But I just wanted to clarify that. This is why I focus so much on form. This is also why I focus so much on real estate and on construction, because I think that this has a very real or concrete way that diaspora starts to function. In a sense, I'm trying to mark the shift away, even inside of these communities, away from ethnic division in terms of diaspora, because as soon as the second or third generation arises, it's no longer so much about ethnic division in a sense. But I think that it's the maintenance of, if it falls on those next generations to maintain these extremely expensive constructions. And this is what keeps them in a position of diaspora, in a sense. This is what keeps them outside of from completely kind of falling into or sort of into mainstream American culture. So the ones that decide to kind of adhere or visit these centers and maintain it after the second, third generation sort of also have to continually project their identity outside of the United States or their own American identity, of which they very much are. And this is why in the final stage this kind of this is why the aesthetic image of the mosque as an anachronistic construction in the first place is important for me, at least.
If I can quickly just reply to your point, would you agree with me in saying that to limit this tension or contradiction to the tension between postmodernism and modernism is a bit reductive? Because in a sense, like if you look at it from a Western European perspective, of course, modernism itself is based on a process of secularization. Here we are talking about postmodern context, a postmodern milieu, the highways, the pictures, etc., etc. We're talking about a utopia of a modern state. So the failure of what happened elsewhere is, in a sense, compensated for, as you said, Pakistan, Iran, etc. It's compensated with the utopia of a possible future, even though utopian, Islamic state in Ohio.
I wouldn't say that.
That's too much, you mean?
I wouldn't say that at all. I wouldn't say that at all. I don't think that it's about. I don't think that people are trying to create an Islamic state inside of the U.S., which is like a kind of perpetual paranoia of secular countries like France and like especially the debate around instituting Sharia law. I think that this idea, when I showed the image of the model, which included the elderly home, the school complex, this large complex, which almost looks like a governmental center or something like this, I think what that's born not out of this attempt to form an Islamic state, but out of the anxiety for a completely uncertain future inside of a land in which they don't have roots or something. I think that's where this sort of starts. I think that it's this after 9/11, the debate around what was moderate and fundamental Islam, brought the American Muslim community they're falling over themselves to sort of demonstrate just how American that they were, to the point where they're having their children join the armed forces to go fight in Iraq and Afghanistan and this kind of thing. These kind of very strange inversions. So I don't. I think that the point made earlier about I think that these communities would very likely like to buy into the American myth of multicultural utopia, of which they're a part of. Also out of the same anxiety that would cause them to build massive structures, or like the utopian image that included schools and elderly homes.
Adrian.
Well, I'm a citizen of a country, Switzerland, which has outlawed the construction of new minarets by popular referendum, which is something I find absolutely scandalous. I'm not proud to be Swiss in that respect, and I hope it's going to be overturned by the European courts. But what it shows is this, it's seen, at least by a majority, it seems, of the Swiss voters, that this whole architecture is seen as a threat somehow. There's a paranoia about that. But from your talk, I also sensed a certain unease about, this architecture. Does it fetishize a certain sort of Orientalist essence that at least is problematic? As you say, it perpetuates a certain idea of Islamness that maybe these people don't necessarily want to project. And, maybe it might be interesting to juxtapose that with the architecture of Jewish community centers in the US, which originally was also in this sort of pseudo-Orientalist style in the 19th century. But nowadays, it could look like a Catholic church or like nothing. It's just like, wouldn't it be better maybe, or if Islamic centers would go that route also in terms of assimilation?
Yeah, I think that's certainly another route. I think that the first Islamic centers and the largest ones don't go that route because they're grandiose projects. I think, the ban on minarets in Switzerland is totally absurd and reactionary. I would agree, and I didn't so much focus on minarets, but it is an interesting point that you make. Like, for example, this mosque has been here for a very long time, and at first, these minarets, because they are kind of modernist and not very highly ornamented, they're actually very functional, and they're constructed using shipbuilding techniques, like folding metal using shipbuilding and this kind of stuff, steel. So they're not very ornate. They actually look extremely functional, and so they appeared as missiles on the horizon when you're driving down the highway. And this is something that people constantly asked about, but eventually people just got used to it. Like, that's kind of what happened in the U.S. I think that there are a lot of mosques, for example, in poor or rural communities who will even take up vernacular architecture in office buildings and also inside of even former churches. They'll turn them into mosques. Those examples, I don't know, this is why I guess I'm focusing on trying to make the distinction between the Islamic center and the mosque, because the mosque can be anything. Like, in Islam, there's no formal regulation for what a mosque should look like in any kind of way. It should just point towards Mecca. This is the idea. So it can become any type of form. But that's why it becomes interesting to me, like, when you have the Islamic center, which is supposed to fold into it all kinds of other social activity, why does it look this way? Like, why does the community decide over and over to make it look in the form of the octagonal plan, the Ottoman mosque? I don't know, it might be better, but it might also be less. It might cover over the kind of tensions and complexity which are actually there. Maybe if they did just look like any old building, I mean, I probably wouldn't be having a talk about it in that case here. So.
I really enjoyed the talk as well, and I had a few comments and a question. I guess the major question is concerning. It seemed like you're projecting this idea that there's a certain kind of a cultural inertia which is created by these structures and by the financial structures that they incur, but also by the formal structures which sit on horizons and as you said, is alien to the American landscape. And it seemed to me that maybe you're overplaying your hand in a certain sense. And although I completely sympathize in a sense with the specific position with regard to emigre experience. I'm marginally involved myself with the Russian emigre community in the United States, and there's always this conversation about why do they have to invest in all this melancholic kind of reproduction of Russianness and all these Russian candies and stuff, and why can't they just be more like us and have more fun with their being hybrid and so on and so forth, be Russian in a smarter way. But on the other hand, it's it's a survival technique. It's a mode of cultural being which has a very long pedigree in the United States, and which, in the end, not to overplay the hand of the sort of melting pot or multicultural utopia, but in the end, it does fit into the landscape somehow. I mean, there is no natural landscape of the United States. It's cornfields and mosque-looking structures go together just as well as cornfields and silos. Go together. There's no specific natural landscape which has to be protected here. So I wonder if is there a way to moderate this discussion in such a way to allow it to be less pinned to a specific political program for the being of communities which pursue their community lives and eventually will fit in somehow. If you walk around Philadelphia, you find Ukrainian Catholic churches which look like Ukrainian Catholic churches. You find Vilna Synagogue, which looks like the Vilna
Kevin,
Synagogue.
could you
Sorry, okay,
speak?
quick.
Could you say in the microphone?
Into the microphone. Just that it seems like eventually something will happen to it that will fit it in some way. And it's the subject position of the immigrant communities is not bound in quite the tight way that you described by this structure. So that's the content of the question. The comments were, in looking at the overall master plan, it seems to me that the master plan could also be interpreted in terms of the formal precedents for it as well. So these big Ottoman caliphate projects also were always big complexes that included baths and libraries and schools. I'm thinking of the Süleyman II Mosque in Istanbul, which looks very much like the master plan for your mosque. It also involved a school, baths, a library, and the whole structure looks very much in the master plan level like this one. So even the structure of the plot, which is not an even rectangle. So I was thinking that maybe the master plan itself could also be structured according to specific Ottoman principles. And then the other final comment was just an interesting case that you might want to look at for comparison is the case of the new mosque that was constructed in the Kazan Kremlin in the 1990s, the Kul Sharif Mosque, which is also an octagonal Ottoman structure, except much more Disney-like than this one, with non-functional minarets. So,
if you want to answer.
No, I mean that's a lot of good comments. It's quite possible that I am, as you say, overplaying my hand. In a sense, maybe because I don't want to simply engage in a descriptive practice, which I don't know, I find less satisfying in a sense. But I'm interested in the way in which form and identity become to merge, how they form an intimate connection, especially when geometry only ever describes itself, octagon. Has a kind of mathematical principle, and it only describes that mathematical principle. So how is it that you can kind of form these associations over time, over large expanses of time, that starts to happen? So that's, and then kind of seeing that, I think that it's interesting, as Lorenzo brought up, in modernity, there's a kind of secularization program, and I think that aesthetics has a very big part to do with that. Once you know what something looks like, once you can anticipate the way that something looks, it's already kind of over. It's already kind of part of the lexicon. It's already part of a visual vocabulary, that there's a level of self-awareness that's involved in the constructing of this identity. And this is why I start to describe it as a kind of inertia, because it's attempting to contain the types of energies which it entails. And also, you know, like that it works in the world, that people know that this looks like a mosque in a sense. The other points you bring up, you're right to say that, like, also a lot of the complexes in Isfahan and Tehran also do the same thing, where they have hospitals, schools, large kitchens, bazaars, all of these things folded into it. And this also, I can expand my paper to go into that direction as well in a longer version. The way I would see that folding now is that just in terms of like contemporary Islamic discourse, there's a kind of imagination that there was once a unity between art and science, and also unity in terms of all social life around religion. And this is like how I wonder that this discourse would be sold within the community or something like this, because that was also within a kind of feudal order that occurred, that was a gift from the Sultanate to the people, but in this case it's coming from the ground up. So, yeah.
May I ask you a question? I'm quite curious because of my total ignorance. Do you think, is it true that I would say religion is the only one unifying force? I mean, that's, you know, if you want to unite a fragmented, I would say, Muslim society, the only way of doing it is just create one more mosque. Are there any cultural figures which potentially could be the same unifying force, except religious buildings in a way? So I'm speaking about, you know, whether it's possible to create some kind of centers which are based, where identification goes not through religious, but through cultural patterns. Whether it's possible, at least potential, or not.
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, part of the reason why I sort of also emphasize that this is part of the industrial automotive corridor, and that these are mosques built by working class people, I think another way in which they could formulate their identity could be if, like in the United States, if there wasn't such a complete collapse of the labor movement, for example, and the union movement, there would be the ability that these people could look at the concrete conditions of their lives, and they could formulate their identity based on their actual positions within society, not based on ethnic identity, but based on the positions that they hold in society as working class. So they could also be oriented around union halls or the labor movement, but this has another complete different history and another type of sort of inertia and failure in the United States.
You know, sorry, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean the political things in a way. But, for instance, I don't know, there was some kind of mythological, you know, some epic things that the greatest poet of some century, which is this unifying figure for many people, you know, not only Arab, but, you know, Muslims anyway. You know, not through religious terms, but through these civic cultural terms. Mm-hmm. Whether it's possible to create a center which is named after, you know, the name of a great poet, a great warrior, I don't know what, but not typically religious. Or simply religion is the only one thing that unites these different Muslim communities. That's what my question. Yeah. I'm not interested in the unions, you know, because it's typically political things. But I mean whether there's a kind of background, cultural background for all these different diasporas, or religion is somehow the only thing that can be developed as a kind of self-identification as a Muslim, or what, or some other identifications could be, you know.
I mean, I think that, for example, religion becomes such an important thing for these diaspora communities, these ethnic communities coming from all of these different places from the Muslim world, because of the history of decolonization and where identity was formed around a religion during the mid-19th century. And so, like, there could have been another way that this happened if those movements didn't collapse. I don't think that religion would have been as important, and I think that people would have maybe developed other forms of identity which were more secular. I mean, like, maybe in my other life I have an interest, but we are sitting in Moscow, so in Moscow there were forms of mass collective organization around symbols and ideals which are not religious but were ideological, and that, yeah, I mean, of the international left. So I think that could be that would be one alternative that I would propose, I think, in a sense. And maybe that's a bit too political, but I think, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.